They made concessions, elites made concessions, and yeah, very successfully for the elites. If you look at the Sunday Times list of the richest people, you'll see the Duke of Northumberland is up there, and whatever it is. So that and he's been up there for 1,000 years since he came over, since his ancestors came over with William the Conqueror. So they managed. That was a good system for them. And the British.
Yeah.
But not everyone managed to do that. Of course, the French. The French elites were much less successful at doing that.
Hi everyone, thanks so much for tuning in. Before we get started, I just have a few short messages. First off, don't forget to like, share and subscribe this podcast. It's the best way to help us grow and help me get on bigger and better guests. Also, don't forget you can pre-order my book, To the Moon, The GameStop Saga, right now by following the links in the description below. We've also got a few quick sponsors for the show today. Are you bored of TV? Do you like drugs but can't afford them? Are you still paying alimony? Well, maybe it's time to read How to See a Man About a Dog, the collected writings. Get your dose of surreal prose and poetry with this dark comedy collection. How to See a Man About a Dog is a collection of experimental short stories, powerful poems, and pulp fiction prose that will take you on a wild, hilarious, and heartbreaking journey. Surrealist short stories, memoiristic poems, and haunting jokes guide you through the wild imagination of emerging writer Samuel Knox. For the reader looking for a wholly original and experimental mixed media approach to stories, How to See a Man About a Dog is a much-needed fever dream tour de force. How to See a Man About a Dog is a kaleidoscope collage made of equal parts delight and despair. Internationally selling author Samuel Knox blends sci-fi, horror, fantasy, and non-fiction into a single, enrapturing vision of what it means to be human in the modern age. You'll find the ebook on Kindle Unlimited and print copies at Amazon, the Book Depository, Waterstones, and most major retailers. Check out How to See a Man About a Dog now and take a journey through the human experience. It's the month of Halloween, and the witching hour is upon us. It's the perfect time to try out one of the spookiest and most intriguing crime podcasts I have ever come across. How I Died is a fiction podcast with a full cast of voice actors and high-quality production value. The series follows John Spacer, who moves to the small town of Springfield, albeit a much less yellow or cheery version of The Simpsons' hometown, and is confronted with a case he's not so sure he can handle on his own. A woman found dead with her husband and child both missing. In episode 1, John begins to hear the voice of the dead woman on his table, and he talks to her as he deciphers just how she might have died. No one knows about John's gift, and he has to hide it from his boss, an untrusting sheriff who is always looking over his shoulder. The first 2 seasons of the show are available on all podcast apps, but be warned, these stories are not for the faint-hearted. The series is for adult audiences, covering topics of murder, threats of violence, and stalking. How I Died has passed over 1 million downloads since its launch, with a vibrant community all trying to solve mysteries along with the show. So that's How I Died. Find it wherever you get your podcasts and see if you can solve the mystery before it is too late. Links for everything will be in the description below, so check them out and then please enjoy the podcast. So, hello and welcome to another episode of Chatter. Today I am here with Professor James Robinson, the co-author of a book I have been raving to many, many people about over the past few months, Why Nations Fail. So, James is the Richard L. Pearson Professor of Global Conflict Studies and University Professor at the Harris School of Public Policy at the University of Chicago. James, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much for having me on.
Yeah, not a problem. It's a pleasure to be able to talk to you. I'm sure that many of my friends who have understood how much I've been talking about your book will be pleased to know that I can talk to you about it instead of droning on to them. So the first question really I had was the books. Now you can correct me if this is a poor interpretation of it, but to me the sort of broad thesis that I took from it was that ultimately freedom as such leads to prosperity. Do you think that's a fair assessment of it? And yeah, so do you think that's a fair understanding of the thesis of the book, at least?
Yeah, I think it is. I mean, I think since the work, since the 1950s, since the work for which Robert Solow got the Nobel Prize, economists have understood that what generates prosperity and economic prosperity and high levels of living standards is innovation. It's creativity, it's entrepreneurship, it's new technologies, new ideas. It's the creativity of individuals. If you think about, what was it that created all this prosperity to start with in the modern world? The Industrial Revolution. What was the Industrial Revolution? Yeah, it was the invention of the steam engine and the railway and mechanization of, factory production. It was all about new technologies. Look at what's going on in the world now with all of these digital technologies and artificial intelligence and robotics, and it's incredible. It's all this genetic engineering. So it's technology, new ideas, creativity. Where does that come from? It comes from people. It comes from people's ideas and ambitions and their projects. And so one of the key words in Why Nations Fail is this idea of inclusive economic institutions. And inclusive economic institutions is about creating very broad-based patterns of incentives and opportunities, so you can tap into all the latent talent in your society. So I think that is freedom. That is freedom in a well-defined sense. You have to be free to follow your dreams and your ideas and your projects. But I guess that the subtle thing in the book, the more subtle thing in the book is that's about economics, and it's about property rights, or it's about markets, or it's about whatever. But behind that is, you could say, is political freedom, which is societies get the economies that they deserve in some sense. We start out by comparing North Korea and South Korea, or Nogales, Mexico, Nogales, United States. So places that are very close to each other with very different economic institutions, very different economic outcomes. But in both of those cases, it's sort of obvious that that's a consequence of political choices and differences in political institutions. And you could say, I mean, it's not the word we use, but you could also say, if you want to have a society which has economic freedoms in the way you mentioned, you have to have political, that has to be underpinned by the right sort of political institutions, which you could call political freedom too, even though that's not what we call it. We call it inclusive political institutions.
Mm. Yeah, I find that the use of the sort of inclusive versus extractive political institutions was one that really resonated with me, and it's a really brilliant way of putting it in, because sometimes I feel like when I'm talking about, I don't know, like democracy or participation in the market or any of these concepts that people tend to just, they're very skeptical of even just like capitalism in general. And most of the time I would say to people that, look, it's not capitalism as such that's the problem. It's like our system has become corrupted to an extent, and you do a really good way of like providing this axis by which it was easier to understand how useful institutions are in a nation to contributing to, I don't know, the overall prosperity. So it's whether something is encouraging a society to be built, or whether it's taking from the nation as a whole. I find it to be, a really fantastic way of defining it. But what would you say the difference here is between like freedom, as we've sort of mentioned, and pluralism? Because that's a concept that comes up quite a lot.
Well, I think pluralism is a word we use to talk about the distribution of political power in society. So if you want to have inclusive economic institutions that create these broad-based opportunities and incentives, then you need to have political power broadly distributed too. So the idea of pluralism is just the word we use. Maybe it's too political sciencey, but it's a word that political scientists use to talk about power being very distributed and spread in society. Because our view is you can't have in any sustainable way an inclusive economy at the whim of some kind of dictatorship. That has to be, people have to be empowered. They have to force the political institutions to deliver an inclusive economy. You can't have it in a sustainable way at the whim of some autocrat or President Xi, or President Putin. I think world history shows that, and we try to bring a lot of world history to the table to illustrate that.
So, how would you say that these ideas encourage prosperity and economic growth? Because one thing that often strikes me is that that people make this distinction. There's like a lot of culture and art and things exported from the sort of more developed, freer, as such, like part of the world. And then people will be like, oh, well, they're not getting, you were not seeing the artwork from the people in the tribes in Africa, which is obviously 100% true. But often I feel like the freedom to just sort of, the freedom is like shown in the different avenues that culture can go down, as well as like economics and politics. But how do you think that the freedom plays into, is it just innovation and creativity, or is there more like a psychological aspect to people being free that allows them to innovate and be creative?
Well, that's a deep question, I think. I think you do see an awful lot of artistic and cultural creativity, associated with the rise of capitalism and the kind of technological innovation, we're talking about. Who is it that, it's like, it's the places that are prosperous in the world, like the United States or Britain or, France or whatever, that dominate modern world culture as well, it seems to me. I think the culture, we try to bring a lot of evidence to the table to say, there's not really a cultural explanation for why North Korea is so poor and South Korea is so much richer. That's obviously to do with these institutions that we're talking about. There's not a cultural explanation for why, Bill Gates did what he did and Carlos Slim in Mexico did what he did, But I do think, there may be something to be said for, obviously there are cultural differences in the world, and it could be, there's deep cultural differences in if you look at China compared to Western countries, or look at Afghanistan, in some sense, the reason that the Western project to transform institutions in Afghanistan failed so miserably is because the cultural context is extremely different, from the cultural context in the West, and in some sense you could say, a famous argument would be, we don't talk much about it in the book, is that what's distinct about Europe and North America, or, is that somehow the economy and economic incentives and capitalism detached itself from society and social institutions, and it disentangled itself from religion and other aspects of society. And in other parts of the world, those things are all kind of enmeshed together, so it's much more difficult, for example, in many parts of Africa, I actually work a lot in Africa, it's much more difficult to think of a sort of separate economic sphere which is disentangled from politics or social life or whatever, whereas somehow, maybe this is the Enlightenment or it's kind of modernity disentangled this thing called the economy, and that's definitely associated, at least historically, with this emergence of capitalism and innovation. And you're raising an enormously complicated issue there, and it's something I do think about. We mostly try to avoid that in Why Nations Fail by kind of looking at things where we could say, oh, it can't be culture really explaining this, North and South Korea, it's the same culture, right? And look at the Japanese. If you've ever been in Japan, Japan is a sort of fascinating place because they actually managed to create a modern economy while preserving many of their historical, cultural attributes or kind of norms and patterns of behavior. So I think this is not well studied in social science. I think we have to recognize that there are these cultural differences in the world. There are these hypotheses along the lines I'm kind of discussing. But I think we also have to recognize that we don't really understand that very well. We don't really understand, why could the Japanese do what they did, and why couldn't they do that in Afghanistan, or in another part of the world? And I'm not sure I know the answer to that. That's a very hard question, I don't know. You asked it. I'm not sure I answered your question properly, but you raised so many issues there.
Yeah, sorry, I have a habit of doing that. I'm trying to get better at it. I get like 1 hour, so I tend to try and cram as much into it as possible. So one of you've pointed out there something that I really, really enjoyed in the book actually was having the fact that you pointed out that there is no like underlying culture that sort of means that things will become like countries will become freer and more prosperous, and you sort of outline a little bit that it's not a cultural thing. It's about decisions that are made in the time that they are made that sort of echo down through history. And essentially, I was wondering if you get any sense that there's some way of sort of trying to tip nations towards falling into, say, the virtuous cycle rather than the vicious cycle. Is there something that you've noticed that sort of tends to characterize the societies that fall into the vicious cycle as opposed to the virtuous cycle, or is it just the sort of draw of history?
Yeah, I mean, we use that terminology to emphasize that, in some sense, when societies get organized in particular ways, that tends to be very persistent. That once a society gets organized with these inclusive economic and inclusive political institutions, then there's many sort of feedback loops, if you like. There's many mechanisms which lead those two things to persist. But so that's the virtuous circle. But there's also this vicious circle, which is that if you're in a society with extractive economic institutions and extractive political institutions, that's also difficult to get out of, because those two things mutually reinforce each other. So what is it that what would lead you from, you're asking, what generalizations can you make about the circumstances under which you exit from extractive institutions to inclusive institutions? And I think we can say something about that, because really every part of the world, like Britain, for instance, that now has pretty inclusive institutions by world historical standards, in the past had extractive institutions. And I, the way we tell that story about Britain, about the emergence of inclusive institutions in Britain, is that, it's really some kind of shock or systemic change, in the British case, I think had a lot to do with the discovery of the Americas, the kind of expansion of trade, the development of this sort of mercantile class that was sort of wealthy, educated, very unhappy with the status quo, of extractive institutions. So that led to conflict. These institutional changes tend to be very conflictual, and think about the collapse of colonialism, or think about the rise of democracy all over the Western world. In the British case, that there was the Peterloo riot. There were the suffragettes. There was, this was a conflictual process. So I think that in the British case, you see there's this kind of tectonic shift in the distribution of income and kind of power, and that disrupts the initial equilibrium. It disrupts its extractive institutions. But then you could sort of say, and this is the subtle part, well, you see many things like that, but then one type of extractive society just replaces the old one. That's something we call the iron law of oligarchy. That's an idea in sociology whereby, you see this all the time in Latin America, whereby there's a very corrupt, it's happening right this moment in El Salvador. There's a very corrupt, sort of ineffectual system in place, and it gets removed from power by a popular uprising, but it gets replaced by a new, very extractive, corrupt system. So why didn't that happen in Britain, for instance, in the Glorious Revolution in 1688? This is the thing we talk about a lot. I think that's really to do with what we call the broad coalition, the existence of a broad coalition. That when people got together and they fought against the monarchy in 1688, against James II. It was really a lot of people. There were these mercantile groups, but there were landowners, there were all artisans, there were all sorts of people. So it was what we call a broad coalition. At the start of the book, we also, in the preface, we talk about the Arab Spring. That may need updating a bit. But one thing we got right was, if you look at the difference between Tunisia and Egypt, why is the transition in Tunisia so much more successful? It's exactly because there was a broad coalition. There were women's groups, there were trade unions, civil society was much more pluralistic, to go back to that word you were mentioning earlier. In Egypt, it was much more narrowly elite, kind of Western educated base in Cairo. It wasn't the same broad coalition that you get in Tunisia. So I think that's the type of generalization that we have, but one that also raises lots of questions, about where does this broad coalition come from? And one thing that I've been studying a lot, more than we used to in the past is kind of ideas, because in some sense, like the history of ideas or philosophical ideas, it's not a coincidence that John Locke's second treatise of government was written about the time of the Glorious Revolution. And Locke kind of gave people a way of thinking about what was the problem with the existing extractive political institutions and how could you reorganize them in a way which was more inclusive. That's not the word he used. I'm just putting words into John Locke's mouth. And I think having that vision of a kind of alternative way of doing things was probably very powerful in creating this broad coalition. So that's something that we've been thinking about quite a lot. There's a kind of intellectual revolution at the same time as there's all this economic change. And that's probably plays an important role. You think of the French Revolution or the American Revolution or the Russian Revolution, for heaven's sake. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, all fantastic examples of that actually. Do you think that's then to do with like an educated, like a certain mass of like educated groups of people in the society to like a certain level where they can kind of come together and philosophize and discuss, the ideals of democracy? Like, do you think those that sort of is part and parcel of a country becoming more inclusive as it like becomes a little more prosperous, then people get a little more educated, and then you end up with the chattering classes as such who sort of think about this, they've got universities perhaps more because there's more money to invest? Or do you think that has to come first, or is this just sort of one of those things that goes in with the mix?
I think it probably goes in with the mix. I think it probably helps, but I think, if you think about the Bolshevik Revolution, that's a great example of what I was calling the iron law of oligarchy, where one extractive regime replaces another extractive regime. And I think using our terminology, the reason that happened is precisely because there was no broad coalition. It was a kind of coup d'etat by a narrow, new elite, the Bolsheviks and the Mensheviks or whatever. So I think what you see in the Glorious Revolution is, there was John Locke and there were educated people and articulate people, but it was genuinely popular also. There were things that brought people together, antagonism against the way the existing system worked that kind of penetrated everyone's lives. So I think what you're describing helps. But I think that's probably not the crucial thing, or it's not the crucial thing for generating kind of really inclusive change.
Okay. One of the things, I managed to find a quote I was looking for there about this sort of cycle of the virtuous cycle, at least anyway. It said, reforms were granted because the elite thought that reform was the only way to secure the continuation of their rule, albeit in a somewhat lessened form, which... It really is a great quote. First off, I'm not sure if that was you or your co-author, Darren, but it made me think quite a lot. We never
go there. Like we jointly own everything. That's our view.
Like Lennon and McCartney.
Exactly. I like that model. Yeah.
Well, it makes you both push the other for the best kind of work, I guess. Because both of your name is going to go on it.
What you're referring to is this sort of reformist model, this British model of a reformist model. That the British, that's how they kind of managed it. They made concessions, elites made concessions, and very successfully for the elites. If you look at the Sunday Times list of the richest people, you'll see the Duke of Northumberland is up there, and whatever it is. So that and he's been up there for 1,000 years since he came over, since his ancestors came over with William the Conqueror. So they managed. That was a good system for them. And the British. But not everyone managed to do that. Of course, the French. The French elites were much less successful at doing that.
Yeah. I mean, I guess we could spend forever speculating as to why that was. But the thing that it really made me think about is whether there is because. So Britain, along with other nations at least, went through this cycle of moving towards a more and more inclusive economic and political institutions as the Industrial Revolution happened, and all the way through to the modern day. I, however, have seen and read quite a lot of work that would suggest, and they used the word extractive before I'd heard you use it. So it was really interesting. I'd read the work of Nicholas Shaxson, who wrote about the size of the financial industry as a curse, as much like a resource curse would work. I don't want to spend forever going into the thesis, but essentially, quite a few commentators or economists, journalists have suggested that quite a lot of the modern institutions of nations like Britain and America have become far more extractive over the past 30 to 40 years. Now, obviously, we're still in a much better position than we were 100 years ago. But I was wondering if you saw any credence in the idea that Britain is shifting from a virtuous circle towards a vicious circle of more extractive institutions, or is that just all of us crybaby snowflakes that have never seen real adversity?
I think it's an important set of issues to think about. My view is, there is some evidence of that. There's a lot of evidence in the United States of, increasing monopoly power, and there's been sort of the average Americans' purchasing power of their wages have been stagnating for the last 30 years, where all these billionaires have appeared, and that, you've seen that before in the United States history. You saw that after the Civil War, this so-called, all these robber barons, the so-called Gilded Age, Rockefeller, all of these people, Vanderbilt. So it's not like that's the first time that it's happened under capitalism. But I do think there is, evidence of more extractive institutions in some dimensions. I would say, it's pretty small relative to the difference between an inclusive and extractive society. Most of my work is in developing countries, and so I just spent a month in Nigeria, for example, this summer. So after you've spent a month in Nigeria, the idea that there's some radical pall sitting over the British economy is a little bit much to take, actually. But I think that's definitely a concern. One thing we point out in Why Nations Fail is that, there's many societies in history that went off the rails. You can revert from extractive to inclusive institutions. There's nothing inevitable about the success of Britain or Western Europe or the United States, and that's for sure. So I think that is important to think about. And I think, the crucial thing is just to look at, where is all this wealth coming from? Do you still see innovation? Do you still see creativity? And I think the answer to that is yes, actually. Most of this enormous wealth is being driven exactly by entrepreneurship, by new technologies, by the spread of the internet. Why are these people so rich? Well, because of globalization, because Zuckerberg because everybody in the world, is looking at Facebook, and Amazon can operate on this enormous scale because of modern technology. So I think that's something to be concerned about for sure. But I don't think there's definitive proof that some of the institutions are becoming more extractive. But I wouldn't say that it's on such a scale that, we should really start talking about, Western societies or North America as being extractive, honestly.
Okay, that's an interesting perspective. I mean, I talk to quite a lot of folks that would be considered probably quite radical by some folks. So it's interesting to hear a sort of more measured answer to that question. I had, for example, Paul Mason on the show, The Economist, and he is, quite keen to tear down capitalism and the structures that we have in favor of something new. And I had the discussion with him that it's maybe not the best idea because tearing things down often leads to, worse things being put in their place unless you've thought it through a lot.
Yeah, I mean, I would think about the politics of that. I think it's sort of undeniable that what you're calling, what we're talking about as capitalism is associated with enormous improvements in living standards, in the last 200 years. And in some sense, the problem in a place like Nigeria, you could say, is that, capitalism hasn't really spread to Nigeria in the way that it flourishes in the Western world. And, and there's lots of institutional and political reasons for that, I would say. Can you imagine, creating prosperity with alternative institutions? I think you can imagine it. It just hasn't happened in world history so far. In economics, there's a lot of discussion of this going all the way back to the 1930s, about could central planning generate the same level of prosperity as a market economy? So it's a very hot kind of intellectual debate for almost 100 years in economic theory. But I'm a sort of British empiricist, so I, you could show it to me in theory, but I'd like to know if it actually ever happened in practice. So I think one should be a little cautious in kind of, I think it is an interesting moment, in world history. It is true at the moment. Like, think about the 19th century. This is actually something Asimoglu and I were discussing the other week, which is, think about the 19th
you stay in
century.
Touch. That's
spread
fun.
of,
You stay in touch. That's cool.
Oh,
after
no,
writing the book together.
We're very good friends. Yeah, we're always talking.
Oh, that's cool.
We have many research. We do lots of research projects, like little things. You're talking about the big things, but we do little nerdy scientific things as well. But, think about the 19th century. Think about capitalism, factory system, markets, the Industrial Revolution. Like, at the same time, what do you have? Like the communism, anarchism, like fascism, you have these massive kind of intellectual trends going off in different directions, somehow as a result of the sort of convulsions that are created in society. And I wonder if the same thing is not about to happen again, maybe that is it, that is indicative of the sort of, there are tectonic changes in the world created by the rise of China, this sort of, the increase in inequality. And so there's a sort of, that's creating an intellectual ferment as well, so it's interesting you should say that about this chap. And, so I'm not quite sure what I think about that. Perhaps I'm being too conservative or something with a small c, but I, it's interesting to think about. Yeah.
No, it's fascinating to think about. I definitely think it's a discussion that I've been having a lot with people. Actually, is there's a lot of talk that like capitalism is the problem, that especially amongst those on the left, and that this is like. And I'm always trying to say is like, look, are you sure it's capitalism and not corruption? And I was listening to an interview you'd done with, I cannot remember who it was, but you said that you felt that using the word corruption is a cop-out for most political scientists or historians and economists because they don't want to talk about politics.
No.
Do you see like corruption within our system to be like a major issue then, or do you find that it's more sort of day-to-day politics that's causing perhaps our inability to move forward on some big issues?
I think you said it exactly right. And we don't. The word corruption doesn't appear in Why Nations Fail because that's partly for academic reasons, as you say. Like when an economist starts talking about corruption, it's a way of avoiding talking about politics. So I'm not going to encourage that. That's just economists. And I also, working in Africa a lot, this word corruption is very complicated to sort of think about in an African context. I can give you a very concrete example of that. A very good friend of mine, I can't tell you who he is, but a very good friend of mine became the minister of finance of an African country. Okay. And so, this Western idea we have, what's corruption? Corruption is, the use of public resources for private benefit. Okay. But in Africa, but that's a very individualistic way of looking at things. In Africa, people are very embedded in groups, in social networks, with kinship, obligations. And, it's a much more collectivist type. African societies tend to be much more collectivist than Western society, with this sort of individualism and kind of, So when you become powerful, you become a minister, you're under all these obligations to use to use this opportunity to further the interests of people to whom you're connected to. So in some sense, the morality is like the reverse. In the Western world, if somebody like that uses public resources for their relatives, that would be morally unacceptable. But in Africa, in many contexts, it's actually the opposite is morally unacceptable. It's morally unacceptable not to use your position to further the interests of your social network. So I think that's the reality of it. So that's another reason why I don't like society's organized in a different way. And I think we have to understand that. So berating, these Africans for corruption is just not understanding the logic of the situation. I don't know, like compared to where not to say that there isn't corruption and going on and, whatever there is. I'm not sure that's a big thing, honestly, though. To me, and the way we think about it is that's a symptom. It's a symptom of institutional problems. It's not really the cause. So when I see someone saying, "Oh, there's corruption," like the United States are just extraditing President Toledo back to Peru, because he's been accused of taking bribes from this Brazilian company, Odebrecht. Okay, that's corruption. Basically, he took a backhand, he put some money in his pocket, in order to give these contracts to Odebrecht. Okay, but is that the problem? No, it's a symptom of the problem. It's a symptom of institutional problems in Peru, if you want that's the way we think that you should think about that. So, is there corruption there's corruption everywhere. There's lots of corruption in Chicago, there's corruption in Britain probably, but I would say it's very small scale compared to the type of corruption you see in Peru, or the type of corruption you see in African countries, modulo, to this. I think it's difficult to interpret, I would say, in Africa. So there's many reasons I don't like talking about corruption, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, I kind of get what you're getting at here. I mean, I guess the one thing I would say is that in America, more so even than Britain, that kind of donation is just given to a super PAC instead of a backhander. They've kind of legalized the ability to give quite hefty sums of money. And as long as it's not given in a direct pay for play scenario, they've legalized the edges of that in such that it's not legally wrong, but perhaps more morally in a sense. But even then, they don't feel bad because it's not illegal. I'd say that's probably the situation we've got. But I want to get to this idea that you've said it's a symptom. So are you suggesting that, for example, a politician who had been elected by constituents who could very easily eject him at the next election if he behaves improperly, a court system that will properly prosecute him, and a media that will report upon it accurately are the things that would, in an ideal and in the theoretically good democratic system, be all the checks that would stop that happening, and that's why it's a symptom?
Yeah, I think transparency also, I think what you're describing in the US is a big problem. It's a big problem in terms of the function of the political system, but it's all kind of out in the open. It's very transparent. It might not be good, but at least it's transparent, and if it's transparent, you can do something about it. The media can publicize it. People can become aware of it. I'll give you a great example going back to Peru. When President Fujimori was in power, he had a kind of his man called Vladimiro Montesinos, who was this sort of he was the guy who managed the dictatorship. And Montesinos bribed everybody. He bribed congressmen. He bribed, Supreme Court justices. But the real action was the TV stations. You could buy a congressperson for like $5,000 a month. You could buy a Supreme Court justice for $20,000 a month. To buy a TV station cost $1 million a month. Okay, so that's what they were really worried about, is the media shining a light on all the things they were doing. So I think that you're right. I mean, I completely agree with you. I'm just saying that transparency is incredibly important, and exactly what you're saying. These institutions of accountability, checks and balances, the judicial system. He was bribing the judicial system, and to make sure he got away with it, and President Fujimori got all the decisions he wanted, he had to completely muzzle all of the media. And in fact, he was ratted out by the one TV station that he didn't bother bribing, because he thought it was just like for rich kind of limeños, like people in Lima and upper class. It was all like arts and culture, and like no real people watched that, so he didn't need to bribe that.
Oh, that's fantastic. The one he didn't bother with.
Yeah, they ratted him out.
Yeah. I mean, it's you can forget about that one little station, and if they're providing good coverage, I think this is why the free market can be great in journalism, at least. That as long as there's lots of people saying lots of different things, eventually, theoretically, the truth you'll rise to the top, and the good journalism will succeed. I think we're in a weird situation with that, with the internet, but we'll power through, hopefully.
Yeah.
But one of the things I wanted to come back to actually was this concept that you talk about in the book, and you mentioned earlier, the iron law of oligarchy. I think it's quite real that it kind of feeds into what I was saying earlier about how we have to be careful if we want to tear down the system, because often then who the incoming people do is just usurp the structures of power that existed there before. And I guess that's basically the iron law of oligarchy. Do you think that applies to just all political systems in terms of, like, for example, maybe you can give like a better example than this, but one that sprung to mind while you were talking was just that I've been thinking a lot about how the norms that Donald Trump broke have now been it means that Joe Biden can get away with a lot of the things that perhaps Barack Obama wouldn't have been able to, in terms of like his rhetoric and just different ways he's going about things, that Trump kind of broke a lot of the norms, and therefore it's very difficult to get them back once they're gone. Do you think that there's like a similarity there in how all our political systems function?
I don't know. I mean, that's a very interesting example. I think we don't know the answer to that. I don't think we're going to know the answer to that until Trump disappears. I think many Republicans are basically playing this game of, oh, Trump is powerful, he's going to get back on Twitter, there's all these people who love him, we have to
I don't think that's happening.
We have to stay on his side. So all this business of, Trump really won the election. Do you honestly think like any Republican Congress people believe that? Maybe 2 or 3 of them do. But they're just saying that because they don't want Trump to go after them. I think we're going to see something radically different when Trump, if he doesn't run. I mean, he's an old guy, so and he's not going to be replaced by any of his children. I don't think there's any chance of that happening. So no. I think it's a very interesting issue. Well, here's another, example, which I guess is a good example, which is, before he was elected, Biden was talking about, changing the Constitution and the Supreme Court. There's all these conservative justices. Do we want to change? He's set up some working group, which actually has one of my colleagues here in it.
Oh, really?
Kind of examine. He's not talking about that anymore. That's disappeared off the table. It seems to me like this more sort of, Trump has eroded all these institutions. Now it's kind of everything's fair game. We can rip up anything that's like not in our interest. And look at this the filibuster also. The Democrats would just love to get rid of that. They're not doing it
until they lose Congress.
I think like what you're raising the $1,001 question about this country at the moment. But so far, things look pretty pretty good from that perspective. I mean, there's many things that are not very good in this country, but I think on the issue of has Trump undermined more broadly the kind of commitment to these norms, my sense at the moment is no. There are some people pretending that, but I think we'll see something very different when Trump disappears.
I mean, I kind of feel like we're seeing a similar thing in the Conservative Party, or, well, just, I would say the UK government, but look, we've had the same one for 10 or 11 years. Again, perhaps you disagree, or you can sort of counter this, but I feel like we're seeing the same thing in the sort of, we're watching an erosion of the role of Parliament in legislating in a way that sort of started in the Brexit process, with them not getting a lot of time to debate issues, and has seems to have carried on through the pandemic and the way we seem to try and make laws. Like they tried to push through the policing bill, for example, and then it sort of shelved, and just things like that seem to be we seem to have got to a point where we sort of rush things through, and it seems to be, like, again, in the same way, undermining things.
I'm not sure I have much of a sense of that. I mean, many people ask me, oh, is Brexit, is this like Trump? And I always say no. The answer is no. I mean, I think Brexit was a terrible thing, extremely unfortunate socially, culturally, economically for Britain. But I think it's a legitimate political issue in some sense, and people have the right to decide on that, I may not like the outcome, but that's democracy, so I think that's very different from the type of attack on institutions that Trump launched, and I don't see anything quite like that. I always like, I work a lot in Latin America, and I remember when the referendum came out, and the Brexiteers had won, and then that was Boris Johnson's moment. That was his moment. That was his Chavez moment, and he disappeared for 3 days. He was so blown away, that he couldn't believe what he'd done. And why was it not his Chavez or his Perón moment? Well, because he's too involved in the system. He went to Eton, he went to Oxbridge. He's too vested in the norms and the system, and he's not an outsider the way Chavez or Perón were, or any of these Latin American kind of neo-autocrats. And so I kind of think I understand what you're saying about the police bill and things like that, and I don't want to belittle this concentration of authority in the state and erosion of democratic practices. But again, I guess I would say my general sense is that's pretty small compared to what Trump tried to unleash on this country. But if you read the federal, if you read when James Madison and all these people were writing the Constitution, if you read Madison's notes of the Constitutional Convention, this is exactly what they expected to happen. You don't design these institutions to have, what's it Madison says, if men were angels, you wouldn't need a constitution. But men aren't angels, and you can't rely on good leadership either. Maybe the first president is going to be George Washington, and we know George Washington is great, But what comes after that, 20 years down the road? So I always tell people, the US Constitution and the institutions, they were designed with Trump in mind. Exactly. That's why you have all of that stuff. That's why you have federalism. That's why you have all these checks and balances. And I think they worked. The fact that Trump couldn't appoint, these people who were counting the votes in Michigan or Wisconsin or Georgia. He couldn't mess about with that. That was exactly how it was designed.
Yeah. So you're saying that, essentially we've seen the institutions take on, because that's something a lot of people did say, is that ultimately Trump wasn't able to do all the horrendous things that people said he was going to do. And it was in a way a triumph of the Constitution that, there was some undermining of things, but that, the country wasn't totally destroyed in 4 years, essentially. No. He didn't declare himself king and, change the ruling place to his apartment in Trump Tower or
it's not a Latin American type transition. You've seen in Latin America, moments like this lead to the overthrow, of relatively, the replacement of something relatively inclusive with something relatively extractive. And there's much less consensus about how to do things in this country than there was when I came here as a student, 35 years ago. But that hasn't happened yet here. I mean, it might happen. It might happen, but everything's possible. Everything happens in human history. So I don't think there's any grounds for being complacent, but it hasn't happened yet. But I must say it was a very unpleasant 4 years.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I'm glad I was over here. It's much nicer. Although, well, we have our own we have our own fights in Northern Ireland. But the last thing I kind of I would like to ask you about is both a sort of something we touched on there, and something that I'm sort of looking at forwards in the future is that I feel like we're in a moment that, as you said, things could go a lot of ways. That there's a lot of, I think that and again, you can correct me on any of these things if you think I've misinterpreted like the consequences of it or what it means. But I think that the rising levels of inequality has, and in my estimation at least, a slightly more extractive trend from a lot of our institutions. And I don't even know if I would call the failure of some of them extractive, but they've failed to do the functions, at least in my mind, that they were designed to do. And I'm attempting to like imagine how we like basically do like a constitutional convention they would have in America, or I don't know what form it would take in Britain to kind of renew things in a way, because I feel like we're sliding down a direction that doesn't end well, with things that you'd mentioned you're not like particularly concerned about the undermining of like sort of some democratic rights of protest, but like for me, I'm at least concerned about it. Like that's just me personally. I don't like the clampdown on things like protest. I don't like the censoring of people online. I don't think they're good ideas generally, which I don't want to get into that. But essentially, like, do you have like any sense of how, or is there an example in history of where a country has sort of sat down and gone, right, okay, we're going the wrong way, people. Let's talk about this and make sure we're heading in a prosperous, pluralistic direction.
I think, no, that definitely has happened in history. I mean, it's happened, in some sense, and we talk about this not in Why Nations Fail, but in our more recent book, The Narrow Corridor, which is that, if you look at Scandinavia, if you look at Norway and Sweden, we think of Norway and Sweden as this kind of egalitarian, cuddly, kind of redistributive, equal societies. But actually, if you go back to the 1920s, there was an enormous amount of conflict. There was almost a communist revolution in Sweden in 1919. There was a huge amount of labor disputes, strikes, violence, like that in the the Great Depression comes, unemployment goes through the roof. That harmony that you see in Scandinavia, for example, is basically kind of manufactured, because people came together in the 1930s and they sort of said, this society's spinning out of control. The Nazis were flourishing, Stalin, they looked around and they thought, my gosh, this is a very scary position we're in here. And they got together and that they created social democracy, the business interests, labor unions, so I think that's a great example of what you're talking about. And you see other examples of that, maybe not quite so successful as that example, but it does happen. Even the U.S. Constitution, there were enormous differences between these slave owners, and people from the North. It was a huge bone of contention, the presence of slavery. People were like absolutely adamantly opposed to slavery, like Hamilton, for example, Alexander Hamilton. Others were big slave owners like Madison himself. And Jefferson, and they thought this was a violation of property rights to talk about abolishing slavery. So that was a pretty big source of kind of conflict at the time of the U.S. Constitution. They found a way of reconciling that. I think you see the Indian Constitution, at the time of the independence of India. Again, that's a good idea. Just enormous interest at play. It's so heterogeneous, that country in India. Like, how did they find a way to kind of create that nation, India, out of all these different peoples and languages and ethnic groups and economic interests? And so I think it's definitely I think it's definitely happened. I think it's one could think of more examples. Think about South Africa also as a very interesting example. The negotiation of the end of apartheid and sort of reconciling the interests of the white people, with democracy, with black, the fact that black people are going to be running the country. And that was a piece of political genius, that Ramaphosa, the current president, he was head of the mine workers union then. He was the main negotiator, for the ANC. So I think there are good examples of that. And I think it's difficult. Obviously, it's very difficult. It's difficult, and it takes a lot of time to do something like that. So there are lots. I think there are examples of that. But, of course, there's many examples where that process sort of failed as well. You could also say, where attempts to do that, there were attempts and they failed. So it's difficult. I'm not sure in social science we have good generalizations about, what is it that leads some of those things to those processes to be a success and others to fall apart.
Yeah, that makes me slightly more hopeful for the future. I will definitely go and check out Sweden. I was not aware that they were going through this thing. I mean, I guess it was the depression and the sort of hangover of the First World War was Europe wide, and they managed to steer away from dangerous, ideas, revolution, civil war, whatever.
Yeah, just think about Northern Ireland, the Good Friday Agreement, and, how difficult it was to, there's some sort of collective recognition that the society has to change. And, but it's very difficult to iron out the details of what that different society looks like, There's kind of enormous emotional investment in different models and the history, the heavy weight of history. I invited Jonathan Powell here, who was, Tony Blair's chief of staff, who played a big role in the negotiations. And he told this fantastic story about Martin, when he first met Martin McGuinness, and he was sort of blindfolded and he was taken off into Derry or whatever it was, London Derry. And then they stopped and they had tea or something, in some house where Martin McGuinness is, and then somebody asked Jonathan Powell, oh, so, what did he start with? The Battle of the Boyne. And Jonathan Powell said, the Battle of the Boyne? No, it took days to get to the Battle of the Boyne. It's there's so much history and, so many grievances and, that have to be recognized and discussed. And, one of my very good friends in Colombia, he was the chief negotiator with these Marxist guerrillas in Cuba, and then that took 5 years. And it's actually a very similar process. You have to understand other people's positions and you have to respect other people's positions and other people's interpretations of history. And so, it's not, these are examples that show it can be done, but it's not easy.
No, it's definitely not easy. I mean, the Good Friday Agreement was famously described as Sunningdale for slow learners, and I believe the Sunningdale Agreement was negotiated in 1974, and it took them 24 more years to get to the Good Friday Agreement. And it was described as being basically the same. Obviously, there were some differences, but the society itself had sort of grown tired of this conflict at that point, I think was the main thing. So that's interesting.
You have to reconcile yourself. That's not so different from the Colombian case, actually. Also, you have to reconcile yourself to something that previously, I mean, another thing Jonathan Powell said, actually, which was very interesting, was that, there's no success without failure. Every success comes on top of a whole bunch of failures. You have to learn from the failures. And he gave he gave many examples in Northern Ireland. I don't remember if he gave that example you're raising here, but he talked about these, you learn, and that's true in Colombia also. There were many failed attempts to negotiate with these Marxist guerrillas. And then you learn, so that everyone, you all learn just at a personal level, you just fail so many times. Me personally, you fail at so many things that have so many setbacks, and you have to learn from that, and you have to kind of move on, and eventually you succeed. Or that's what I tell my students.
Well, I'm hoping that's the case. I mean, yeah, making this podcast has been many a setback, and that's just me doing this. That's not the the whole problems of a nation and all the historical things that come along with it. Perseverance. Have you got time for one more question? Actually, I've just remembered one thing I was thinking about earlier that I wanted to quiz you on.
Go for it.
Essentially, I'm not sure how familiar you are with the idea of Strauss-Howe generational theory and the fourth turning. I think the name was the book, and essentially that they hypothesized that human societies and history has chapters that cycle through. It's basically like a more academic attempt to look at that old adage of strong men make good times make weak men make hard times make strong men. Do you give any credence to that theory that we kind of have like cycles of history where things will degrade and then be rebuilt as sort of generations build something they're proud of, the next ones become cynical, the next ones don't trust it, and then everything falls apart, and then we have to rebuild?
Yeah, not really, actually. I don't think that's. I mean, I think the main way we think about these dynamics is more like this vicious and virtuous circle, as as we were discussing earlier. I'm not sure that I believe these cyclical theories of world history. I mean, the last few years I've spent an awful lot of time reading about Chinese history and Chinese culture. And, what you see in China is that there's this sort of, I guess you could say maybe they operate at different levels. What I see when I look at Chinese history is this enormous continuity, between the imperial state or even pre-imperial kind of philosophical revolutions with like Confucius and the kind of creation of these great classic works about the organization of Chinese society. And then how enormously persistent that is. But I guess you could say at a different level, you do see cycles. You see these collapses of the dynasties. Maybe we saw a new cycle with the collapse of the imperial state, a rise of communism, the disappearance of communism, and the return of something much more like the imperial state than the communist state was. So you could sort of say maybe it depends what level you're looking at and where you want to focus. And that could be some way of reconciling the way I tend to think about things with there are these cycles sort of going on like that. But underneath it, there are these kind of, there are these sort of tectonic processes. And I suppose that's just what I like to focus on.
You're looking at the long arc of history rather than the course of a couple of generations.
Well, that sounds very pretentious, but I don't mean you're pretentious. I mean it would sound pretentious to me to say that's what I'm doing, but it's
that's right. I said it.
That's somehow what I look for, I suppose, or what I tend to see. Yeah, I mean, yeah.
Well, James, I really, really want to thank you for your time. It's been like a real pleasure for me to get to sort of pick your brain on a few things. Everybody, Why Nations Fail, definitely my favorite book that I've read this year, and it's just stuffed full of facts, historical anecdotes, and some fantastic theory as well. So, is there anything you want to plug before we go?
No, it's very exciting. The reason we wrote this book, Professor Acemoglu and I have written many academic scientific papers published in obscure journals, kind of completely unreadable. And, the reason that we wrote this book, which is, thought of as a very bizarre activity for people like us, is exactly so that someone like you could get excited about it. So, so I'm just really thrilled to hear all that, and I'm really thrilled to be on the show. Yeah, thank you.
No problem. Yeah, let's finish things there. Thank you so much for listening. Don't forget today's sponsor, How to See a Man About a Dog. For the reader looking for a wholly original and experimental mixed media approach to stories, How to See a Man About a Dog is a much needed fever dream tour de force. It combines dark comic short stories, powerful poems, and pulp fiction prose to create a heartbreaking and hilarious journey that readers will not soon forget. Read How to See a Man About a Dog, collected writings, for free with Kindle Unlimited, or get it at major retailers everywhere. thanks for making it all the way to the end of the video. Don't forget to like, share, subscribe, and leave a comment for us in the comments below. Let me know what you thought and if you'd like to see more of this from the show. Thank you, and we'll see you again next time.